The moment my father-in-law introduced me to his partners as my son's wife, she teaches kindergarten, I smiled and shook their hands. I didn't correct him. I had learned over 4 years of marriage that correcting him only made things worse. He would smile that particular smile of his, patient, indulgent, the way you smile at a child who has said something charming but incorrect, and then he would find another way to remind everyone in the room exactly where he believed I stood. What he didn't know, standing there in his Armani suit in the lobby of the most prestigious cardiothoracic surgical center on the East Coast, was that the conference he was about to attend, the one where he planned to announce his hospital group's acquisition of this very building, this very institution, was the same conference where I had been invited to deliver the keynote address. He found out 11 minutes later. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's the moment everyone asks about. What they don't ask about, what they never ask about, is the 7 years it took to get there. The 7 years of Sunday dinners where my father-in-law held court at the head of the table and talked about his work the way other men talk about religion. The 7 years of watching my husband go quiet every time his father entered a room. The 7 years of being asked at every family gathering whether I was still doing the classroom thing. My name is Audrey. I'm 39 years old. For the last 12 years, I have been a cardiothoracic surgeon specializing in pediatric valve reconstruction. For the last 6 of those years, I have been the lead surgeon on a federally contracted program that I cannot, even now, discuss in full detail. What I can tell you is that it involved children. It involved conflict zones. It involved operating in conditions that would make most surgeons in private practice retire on the spot. And it required a non-disclosure agreement that covered not just the program itself, but my participation in it, meaning that for 6 years, when someone asked what I did, I said, surgical consulting, and left it at that. My father-in-law's name is Raymond. He built his career on being the loudest person in any room. He is not a bad surgeon. He was actually quite good in his prime, cardiac work. Boston in the 90s, before he transitioned into hospital administration and discovered that managing surgeons paid significantly better than being one. He is the kind of man who has strong opinions about everything and mistakes the volume of those opinions for their validity. He loves his son. He has never, not once in the 7 years I have known him, asked me a single question about my work that wasn't rhetorical. The first time I met him was at a dinner in Cambridge, 3 weeks after my husband and I started dating. My husband, his name is Patrick, had warned me in the car on the way over, not in a direct way. Patrick doesn't do direct. He said, my dad can be a lot, and then he turned up the radio. I understood what he meant within 6 minutes of sitting down. Raymond spent the first 20 minutes of dinner asking Patrick about his position at the law firm. He spent the next 10 asking me where I went to college, and when I told him, he nodded slowly, that specific nod that means acceptable but not exceptional, and said, good school. What are you doing with it? When I told him I was finishing my residency in cardiothoracic surgery, he said, pediatric? With the slight downward inflection, as if I had just told him I'd chosen a minor instrument in a major orchestra. Pediatric cardiac surgery is extraordinarily complex, I said. Of course it is, he said, and moved on. Patrick caught my eye across the table. I could see the apology in his face before he even opened his mouth. I shook my head slightly. It's fine. I had met men like Raymond before. I knew how to navigate them. You don't argue, you don't perform, you simply do your work and let the work speak. It had always been enough. What I didn't account for was what it would feel like to do that for 7 years inside a family. Patrick and I got married in a small ceremony in Vermont. His mother, Carolyn, was warm and funny and slightly overwhelmed by her husband in the way that people become overwhelmed by weather. Not resentful, just adapted. She squeezed my hand at the rehearsal dinner and told me I was exactly what Patrick needed. Raymond gave a toast that was largely about Patrick and included one sentence about me. Audrey is a physician, which means she and Patrick will never argue about who works harder. Everyone laughed. I laughed too. Over the following years, Raymond's attitude toward me calcified into a pattern that was consistent enough to become almost comfortable in its predictability. At Christmas, he talked about his hospital group's expansion. At Thanksgiving, he talked about the surgeons he'd recruited. At every birthday party for every grandchild, he talked about his legacy. I was present at these conversations the way furniture is present, acknowledged when necessary, otherwise unremarkable. The thing that surprised me, the thing that still surprises me when I think about it, was that it wasn't malicious. Not exactly. Raymond didn't dislike me. He simply had a hierarchy in his mind, architectural in its certainty, and in that hierarchy, what I did not register as significant. I was a physician who worked with children at a hospital he had never heard of, in a program he knew nothing about, for a salary I never discussed. I was a wife. I was a mother. I was the daughter-in-law who does something medical. He once, at a 4th of July barbecue, introduced me to a colleague as a pediatrician. I let it stand. Patrick heard it. He looked at me afterward when we were alone on the back porch and said, "You should say something." "It doesn't matter," I said. "It matters to me." "I know. But saying something won't change what he thinks, and what he thinks doesn't change what I do." Patrick was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Sometimes I think you're the most patient person I've ever met, and sometimes I think you're just avoiding a fight. Can't it be both?" I said, and he laughed, and we went back inside. The federal program I worked with, I'll call it what it was publicly described as, a medical consultation initiative, had a declassification timeline built into its structure. I knew from the beginning that there would come a point when the NDA would lift in phases. Not everything, not all at once, but enough. Enough for me to say in a professional context what I had actually been doing. Enough for the record to reflect the work. That declassification began processing the February before the conference. I received the notification on a Tuesday. I was between cases. I read the email twice, standing in the corridor outside the OR in my scrubs, and then I called the program administrator and asked what I was and wasn't authorized to discuss. She told me. I thanked her. I stood in that hallway for probably 3 minutes longer than I needed to, not because I was planning anything, but because I was trying to understand what I felt. What I felt, mostly, was tired. 7 years of she teaches kindergarten. 7 years of watching Raymond tell the story of his career at every dinner table, every gathering, every professional event. Patrick and I attended together, while I ate my salad and nodded and said nothing. I wasn't angry. Anger would have been simpler. I was just tired, and under the tiredness, something else. Something I hadn't let myself name, that felt a little like readiness. The conference was in April. The American Society of Cardiothoracic Surgeons annual meeting held that year at a convention center in Philadelphia. I had been invited to deliver the keynote address 3 months earlier, shortly after a paper I co-authored on minimally invasive valve reconstruction in pediatric patients under field conditions was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. The invitation came from the Society's program chair, a woman named Dr. Harmon, who told me the paper had generated more discussion in the field than anything published in their journal in the past 5 years. I accepted. I booked my hotel. I did not mention it to Raymond. I mentioned it to Patrick. Patrick looked at me for a long moment when I told him. Then he said, "Does my father know about any of this? The paper, the keynote, any of it?" "No," I said. "Audrey." He never asked Patrick. He sat with that for a moment. "He's going to be there," he said. "His hospital group is presenting a proposal for a partnership acquisition. He told me last month." I already knew. The conference program listed all presenters. Raymond's group was scheduled for the afternoon breakout session. My keynote was the morning opening address. "I know," I said. Patrick looked at me the way he sometimes looks at me when he's trying to figure out if I'm doing something very simple or something very complicated. "Are you okay with that?" "I'm not doing anything," I said. "I'm giving a talk I was invited to give. He's attending a conference he registered for. If those things happen to be in the same building, that's not my design." "Right," said Patrick, and the way he said it told me he understood exactly what I was and was not saying. I wore a dark gray dress to the conference, the kind that reads as serious without being severe. I had my credentials badge on a lanyard. Keynote speaker, it said, in slightly larger font than the regular attendee badges. I arrived early. I went through my slides. I drank bad convention center coffee and talked to two residents from Johns Hopkins who were nervous and bright-eyed and reminded me of myself 15 years ago. I did not see Raymond until I was walking toward the main hall for the opening session. He was standing near the registration desk with three men I didn't recognize, his business partners, I assumed, from the acquisition group. He was in his suit, the charcoal one he wore to important events. He was laughing at something one of the other men had said. He looked confident, at ease, fully in his element. He saw me before I reached the desk. For a fraction of a second, just a fraction, his expression did something complicated. Surprise, recalibration, a quick reach for the smile he keeps ready. He found it. "Audrey," he said warmly, spreading his arm slightly in that gesture that substitutes for an embrace. "What are you doing here?" "I'm speaking this morning," I said. "Oh, they have a program for family practitioners? Or is it pediatrics?" He turned to his colleagues with a kind of comfortable authority, the way a man turns to an audience he knows is his. "My daughter-in-law is a physician. Wonderful with children." One of the men smiled politely. Another glanced at my badge. The third one, older, silver-haired, with the careful posture of someone who has spent decades in operating rooms, looked at my badge longer than the others. Then he looked up at me. "Are you Dr. Audrey Callahan?" "I am," I said. He extended his hand immediately. "I read your paper 3 times. The reconstruction protocol you developed for the field triage context. I've been waiting to hear you speak about it for months." Raymond's smile stayed in place. I will give him credit for that. "The paper was a collaboration," I said. "But thank you. I'm looking forward to the conversation today." "The keynote address," the silver-haired man said to Raymond in a tone of genuine enthusiasm. "Your daughter-in-law is opening the whole conference," Raymond said. "Of course she is," in a voice that was perfectly calibrated and completely empty of prior knowledge. He was good at recovery. I had always known that. I excused myself and went to take my place at the podium. The hall held roughly 800 people. I had spoken to larger audiences. I had on one occasion briefed a group in circumstances I still cannot fully describe, with helicopters audible from outside and fluorescent lights that kept flickering. So 800 physicians in a convention center in Philadelphia was not what made my hand shake slightly as I gripped the podium. What made my hand shake was the particular knowledge that Raymond was in the 4th row. I had seen him find his seat while I was arranging my notes. He was flanked by his partners. He was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on his face in 7 years of Sunday dinners. Something between assessment and recalibration, still working out what to do with what was in front of him. I took a breath. "The first child I operated on in a non-clinical setting," I said, "was 4 years old. She had a congenital mitral valve defect that had gone undiagnosed for the first 3 years of her life because the region she was born in had no cardiac imaging equipment within 200 miles. When she came to us, she had roughly 72 hours. The OR was a converted supply room. The lighting was inadequate. The anesthesiologist and I had been awake for 19 hours, and she is 11 years old today." The room was quiet in the way that rooms get quiet when everyone has decided simultaneously to pay attention. I gave the talk. All of it. The program, the protocol, the outcomes data, the children. 43 minutes. I had practiced it enough that it felt like breathing. I talked about what it meant to operate in conditions that bore no resemblance to the settings we train in. I talked about what fear does to fine motor control, and what experience does to fear. I talked about the 71 children we had treated over 4 years, whose outcomes would never have appeared in any standard database because their names and locations were protected by classification orders that had only recently begun to lift. When I finished, the room stood up. Not immediately. It's never immediate. There's always that half second where the audience processes what they've experienced and decides what to do with it. But they stood, and in the moment before they stood, I looked at the 4th row. Raymond was not standing yet. He was sitting very still, in the specific stillness of a man who is working through something significant. His partners were already on their feet. The silver-haired man was the first one up. Raymond sat for 3 or 4 seconds longer than everyone around him. Long enough for his stillness to be visible, for the people beside him to notice. Then he stood. slowly, without looking away from me. The reception afterward was the kind of event where you spend an hour moving from cluster to cluster, accepting congratulations and answering questions, and I did that efficiently. Keeping one part of my attention on the room the way I keep one part of my attention on a patient's vitals, even when I'm talking to a family. I knew he would come find me eventually. I knew this the way I knew a lot of things. Quietly, without drama, as simple fact. He came to me when the crowd had thinned. When we were both standing near the same table of coffee carafes, as if we had arrived there by coincidence. Audrey, he said. Raymond. He was quiet for a moment. He picked up a cup of coffee he didn't pour. Set it back down. I didn't know, he said. About the program. About any of it. I know you didn't. You never said. I couldn't. For most of it, I genuinely was not permitted to. And then when I could, I paused. I suppose I got used to the silence. He looked at me then, and something in his face did what I had never seen it do in 7 years. It got smaller. Not weaker, not diminished, just smaller, in the way that faces get small when a person is being honest, in a way they haven't been honest in a long time. I made assumptions, he said. You did. About what you were capable of. He exhaled. I made you smaller than you were. Every time I introduced you as. He stopped. It's all right. It isn't, he said. I'm a physician. I know what this work is. I know what it costs. And I wrote it off because. He stopped again. This time the silence was longer, because it was easier than revising what I'd already decided. I didn't fill the silence. I had learned, in operating rooms and in the field and at 1,000 Sunday dinners, that some silences need to be held, not patched. Patrick has always known you were exceptional, he said finally. He told me, once, early on. He said, Dad, you don't know who she is yet. I didn't listen. Patrick is very loyal, I said. He got that from his mother, Raymond said, and there was something almost rueful in it, self-aware in a way he rarely permitted himself to be. I thought about the next thing I was going to say. I thought about it carefully, the way I think about a surgical approach before I make the first incision. I don't need you to be sorry, I said. I need you to know. There's a difference. He looked at me. Knowing changes how you see people going forward. Sorry is just about the past. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. Not the slow, condescending nod I had known for 7 years, but something shorter and more direct. Something that meant he had received what I said and was putting it somewhere he intended to keep it. I have a colleague, he said. Outstanding surgeon. 32 years old, female, trained at Stanford. I have not given her work the regard it deserves, for reasons I am now finding difficult to justify. She probably knows, I said. Yes, he said. I imagine she does. Then I'd start there, I said. Not with an apology, with attention, the genuine kind. He picked up the coffee cup again. This time he poured the coffee cup again. This time he poured the coffee. He stood with it for a moment, and I had the impression of a man taking inventory of something, a long list, items he'd misspelled, needing reorganization. The presentation I'm giving this afternoon, he said. The acquisition proposal. I'm proposing a partnership with this institution. I know, I said. You've been affiliated here for how long? 6 years? He absorbed this without comment. The proposal will be stronger, he said slowly, if I've actually spoken to the surgeons who do the work here, rather than just the administrative leadership. Substantially stronger, I agreed. He finally drank his coffee. Over the rim of the cup, he looked at me with an expression that was, not for the first time in his life, I thought, but perhaps for the first time in mine, entirely without performance. Patrick chose well, he said. I should have said that a long time ago. You're saying it now, I said. I didn't tell him it was enough. I didn't tell him all was forgiven, that 7 years of being unseen dissolved in one honest conversation over bad convention center coffee. Life doesn't work like that, and I've never been interested in pretending that it does. What I told him was the truth. That knowing matters more than sorry, that he was still capable of changing how he saw the people in front of him, and that his afternoon presentation would benefit significantly from talking to me for 40 minutes before he walked into that room. He took me up on it. The acquisition proposal he presented that afternoon was, by every account I heard later, the most substantive pitch of the day. He cited current research by name. He referenced outcomes data that the administrative leadership didn't even have in front of them. He talked about the work, the actual work, the patients, the surgical protocols, with a fluency and a regard that surprised everyone in the room, including, I was later told, his own partners. When Patrick called me that evening, I was in my hotel room with my shoes off and a glass of wine I had been intending to drink for 45 minutes. My father called me, he said. I figured he would. He was. Patrick paused, and in the pause I could hear him searching for the right word. He was different. He said something I have never heard him say. What did he say? He said, I've been wrong about Audrey, not about what she does, about who she is. I looked at the ceiling. Outside, Philadelphia was doing whatever Philadelphia does at 8 o'clock on a Thursday evening. Traffic, voices, the ordinary texture of a city that doesn't know anything about what happened today and has no reason to care. That's a start, I said. It's more than a start, said Patrick quietly. Maybe he was right. I thought about the residents I had talked to that morning, nervous and bright-eyed at the beginning of the long work of becoming who they were going to be. I thought about the 4-year-old girl who is 11 now, who has no idea that in a supply room in a difficult place, someone kept her heart beating through one very long night. I thought about the people who had sat in that hall and stood up, and what it meant that the work had finally been allowed to speak. I picked up the wine. It had always been mine to claim. I had simply been waiting for the clearance to claim it. I've thought a lot about those 11 minutes. The walk from the registration desk to the main hall. The way Raymond's smile stayed perfectly in place while the world he thought he understood rearranged itself around him. 11 minutes between She's Wonderful with children and 800 people in a convention center getting to their feet. People ask me if I planned it. I always tell them the same thing I told Patrick. I wasn't doing anything. I was giving a talk I was invited to give. But that's only partly true. The fuller truth is that I had made a choice, years earlier, to let the work carry the weight, to trust that if I kept doing it with everything I had, it would eventually speak louder than any correction I could have offered at a dinner table. That choice required something from me every single time Raymond introduced me as a pediatrician, every time he talked past me to get to Patrick, every time he held court about a field I was quietly operating in. It required me to hold my own understanding of myself steady, without requiring him to validate it. That steadiness didn't come from indifference. I want to be clear about that. It came from knowing what the work was actually worth. Knowing it in the way you know something after you've done it at 2 in the morning in inadequate lighting with a child's heart open in front of you. Not as a concept, not as a credential, but as a lived, irreversible fact. Intellectual honesty is like that. It doesn't need an audience. It needs you to be honest with yourself first. About what you know and what you don't, about where you've earned the right to stand and where you haven't. I had earned it. I knew I had. That knowledge was mine to keep whether Raymond could see it or not. What I didn't expect, what genuinely surprised me, was that the moment he could see it, he was willing to look. That took something from him too. It takes a particular kind of character to sit in the 4th row and watch the evidence revise your long-held assumptions in real time, and then to go find the person and say, with no audience, no applause, and no advantage to yourself, I was wrong about who you are. Raymond is not an easy man. He is not warm in the way that some people are instinctively warm. But he did that. He walked over to a coffee table at a conference in Philadelphia, and he told the truth without being asked to. I don't take that lightly. And I think about his colleague, the 32-year-old surgeon he mentioned, the one he hadn't been giving her due. I'll never know what he said to her, or whether he said anything at all. But I know what it cost him to name it to me. That cost is where real change actually lives. Not in grand gestures, not in public acknowledgement, but in the private reckoning. The moment when a person decides that being accurate about someone else matters more than being comfortable about themselves. I picked up my wine that night and I thought about the girl who is 11 now. She has no idea. She's just 11, living her life, doing whatever 11-year-olds do. She doesn't know that her being alive required someone to stay focused and precise and unafraid of the right things on a very hard night in a very difficult place. That's how it mostly goes, I think. The work happens in the dark. The results show up in the light, and somewhere in between, if you have held yourself together with enough honesty and enough endurance to keep going when no one is watching, the distance between those two things closes. That closing is the whole point. It always was.